All right, I will say good morning and a good Chodesh to everyone. Let us begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for this last day of Shvat. Bracha Strimber, in loving memory of her husband, Avi Strimber, Avraham ben Kálman, Eლიעזר, הלוי, זיכרונו לברכה. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. To thank Avi Tobias for his Talmud Torah dedication for this month and appreciation for the shir and for all of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's beautiful Torah. Our week of learning sponsors, Gabi and Shana Cohn, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Shana's beloved father, Avraham Strimber, Avraham ben Kálman, Eლიעזר, הלוי, whose yahrzeit actually is today. Again, we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. With that, let us begin. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. I also just want to take the opportunity to thank Rabbi Kálman Akiva for giving shir yesterday, and to thank both Maishi and Jeremy for setting up the technology so that I was able to give shir. Even tried to do it live, but as you saw, because of technical difficulties, we switched to recorded. But Baruch Hashem, was a great source to be able to continue giving the shir when I was away. But it's wonderful to be back, Baruch Hashem, with all of you. So we'll say, let's begin. Today's daf is Chof. We're going to pick up, I know you got a little bit further, we're going to pick up in Meretz Hashem, 6 lines up from the bottom on Yud Tesma, Beis 19b. I know you left off about 3 lines up from the bottom, but let's just re-begin the sugya. But let's say some really fascinating sugyas in today's daf. So, Abaye asked the following shayla from Rava. Kavru beregel, what happens if someone passed away during Yom Tiv, and therefore the levaya took place on Chol Hamoed? Regel ola lo leminyan shloshim, o ein regel ola lo leminyan shloshim. Suppose a very interesting shayla. Someone dies on Chol Hamoed, okay, or Yom Tov for that matter. Burial takes place on Chol Hamoed itself. Now, we've already established that Shiva will not begin until after Chol Hamoed. Also, remember again, just to clarify, we have two cases. Here. Case number 1 is someone died before Yom Tov. We're going to get into all of this again today. Someone died before Yom Tov. Shiva began before Yom Tov. What happens when Yom Tov comes? Yom Tov cancels Shiva. Now we said there's a whole machlokes. Yet you have to observe one moment of Shiva, 2 days of Shiva, 3 days of Shiva. We're going to see that again today. But again, let's just establish someone dies before Yom Tov, Levaya is before Yom Tov comes along, cancels Shiva. Case number 2, which is our case over here, is person passed away during Yom Tov. Levaya is during Chol Hamoed. Everyone will agree as of now that halacha l'maisa Shiva will begin after Yom Tiv. So the clock for Shiva starts after Yom Tiv. The shaila is, do the days of Yom Tiv count towards the days of Shloshim? Can we start the clock for Shloshim as of the time of the Kvura or not? Now, both say, I understand why this is an anomaly. Normal Hilchos Avelos is such. You have a progression. Shiva, Shloshim, and then for a parent, Yud Beis Chodesh 12 months. But the clock for everything usually begins with Shiva. So Shiva is the first day of Shiva, which makes sense. It's also the first day of Shloshim, and it's also the first day of Yud Beis Chodesh. What the Gemara is asking over here is, in this kind of case where where Shiva is going to be delayed, I know Shiva won't start until after Yom Tiv, but can the clock for Shloshim, could it begin on Yom Tiv itself? So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, so the truth is, I know that the days of Yom Tiv can't count towards Shiva. Why? Because the practices of Shiva cannot be observed over Yom Tiv, right? So you can't observe the customs of the behaviors of Shiva. Rashi says over here, Devade lo naga mitzas Shiva beregel. De'ino asa bin iras asandal v'inroi b'kfiyas amita. So Rabbi say the practices of Shiva, not wearing shoes, sitting on a low chair, turning over the bed, prohibition of marital relations, these are things that do not apply on Yom Tiv. So I understand, of course, that the clock for Shiva can't begin on Yom Tiv. Ki kami baile leminyan shloshim. This is very interesting. The reason we're asking is for shloshim is why? Dekanaga mitzvahs shloshim beregel. Because Rabbi say, if you think about it, interestingly enough, a lot of the prohibitions of shloshim already apply on Yom Tiv as well. For example, Rashi says, laundering clothing, cutting your hair. So Rabbi say, these are things I can't do over Chol Hamoed anyway. Now, granted, it's for a totally different reason. But isn't it fascinating to see how there is a behavioral overlap between avelus, between sadness and simcha? Let's say, isn't that incredible? It's the same practices. I can't launder my clothing. I can't go ahead and shave and take a haircut. We already established it. We spent significant time talking about this in Moed Kattan, that you're not allowed to do these things on Yom Tiv. Again, for a totally different reason. But maybe since the same practices for mourning and simcha apply, maybe the clock for shloshim could actually begin on Yom Tiv. Incredible. So the Gemara says, "My Amrle ino olam." So Rava said back to Abaye, no, shloshim does not count. In other words, the days of Yom Tiv do not count to the tally of shloshim. Ultimately, again, the clock for shloshim will not start until when? Until after Yom Tiv, together with the clock for Shiva. Eisvei, say Abaye is the kasha, hakovres meiso, shnei yomim kodim haregel. If a person buries his dead 2 days before Yom Tiv, mona chamish yomim achar haregel. So we'll say, this is an interesting setup over here. So the Gemara says as follows: if a person goes ahead and buries his dead 2 days before Yom Tiv, so he'll observe 2 days of Shiva before Yom Tiv and 5 days afterwards. V'chamisha yomim achar haregel. 5 days after Yom Tiv, umalachto nasis al yedei achirim, and during those 5 days after Yom Tiv, his work could be performed by others. Which means we'll say other people could do his malacha for him. So the Gemara says, "Va'avadav v'shivchosav osim etzina," and his own servants could go ahead and do work in his home, but do it privately. B'sof beso ve'ein rabbi misaskibo, and the public no longer needs to come and visit him. Right? Why? Shekvar chafal mandalav shekvar nisasko bo beregel. We'll say this is actually very interesting because the assumption is that since he started Shiva before Yom Tiv, people were Menachem Aval before Yom Tiv, and when else? On Chalamayid as well. So effectively, the days of mourning, right, of the public consoling him have already taken place. So in the 5 remaining days after Yom Tiv, people don't have to come visit him. Klalo shal davar, here's the rule, Kol shehu mishum evel regel mafsiko. They both say, in general, the halacha is as follows: anything that is a result of avelus, Yom Tiv stops. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Top Rashi, Chafam Dalud. Kol shumishum eva regel mafsiko. Shetarach lashlimo achar haregel. Kevan dechi yashav shnei yomim v'nei haregel. Tarach lahashli b'leishi chamisha achar regel. So here's the klal. Anything that is because of avelus, when Yom Tiv comes, Yom Tiv stops it, and therefore must be resumed after Yom Tiv. Now, both I just want to point out, you already know this. We don't paskin this way. We don't paskin this way at all. But again, we're just going to go through the process. V'chol shemishum iskei rabim, but whatever has to do with the public, which really means when it comes to the public consoling the individual, that Yom Tiv doesn't really stop. People continue to visit the mourner even over Yom Tiv as well. Therefore, ein regel mafsigo. Therefore, ultimately, again, the Yom Tiv does not go ahead and stop that. Okay. Kavro shlosham sof regel. But say, what happens if they buried a person? So Reuven lost his father. So now Reuven buries his father sometime during the last 3 days of Yom Tiv. All right, so last day of Chalamayid before last days of Yom Tiv. To me, it's galus. Right, b'sof regel, mona shiva achar regel. In that case, I will say he goes ahead and observes a full shiva after Yom Tiv. Mona shiva, right? Mona shiva achar regel. Arba'as yomim harishulim rabbi misaskimo. For the first 4 days of that shiva, people come to console him. I will say the reason it's only 4 days is because since his loss was experienced during the last 3 days of Yom Tiv, the assumption is that as soon as he experienced the loss, what happened? People began to come to console him already then. Therefore, they don't have to keep coming for another 7 days. Rather, again, they only have to come for another 4 days. Therefore, again, so Rabbi Misaskim bo shloshim machronim. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Misaskim, Arba yom harishon Rabbi Misaskim bo. So shloshim machronim in Rabbi Misaskim bo shekvar nisasku beregel. But the last 3 days of the Shiva, the public does not have to come and visit because the assumption is they already visited with him during the last 3 days of Yom Tiv. The regel olelo. And the days of Yom Tiv count towards the shloshim. So we'll say here the Bracha says explicitly. Now the Gemara says, "My love aseifa." Is this not referring to the last case? Well, remember again, the Bracha gave me 2 cases. Case number one, Reuven lost his father 2 days before Yom Tov. What did the Bracha say in that case? 2 days of Shiva before Yom Tov, 5 days of Shiva after Yom Tov. That's Reuven's personal obligation. Does the public have an obligation to visit Reuven after Yom Tov? And the answer is no. Why? Because the assumption is, not the assumption, they visited him during the 2 days before Yom Tov, and the assumption is they're going to continue to visit him for consolation purposes over Yom Tov as well. That's case one. Case two, Reuven lost his father 3 days before the end of Yom Tov. What's the halacha? The halacha is he observes a full Shiva after Yom Tov, but the public is only obligated to go ahead and visit him when? During the first 4 days of his Shiva. Why? Because again, the assumption is they started visiting him as soon as he experienced his loss. So you've got 3 days of Yom Tov, first 4 days of Shiva, that's 7 days. The last 3 days they don't have to visit him. And then the Bracha says, V'regel olalo, and the days of Yom Tov count towards the Shloshim. So the Gemara says, My love Aseifa, isn't that talking about the last case where he endured the loss on Yom Tov itself? And from here, what do you see? You see that the days of Yom Tov do count towards the tally of Shiva. To which the Gemara says, Lo, Aresha. No, maybe not. Maybe it's referring to the first case. Rabbi said, what was the first case? The first case is where he experienced the loss when? 2 days before the start of Yom Tov. So maybe when do the days of Yom Tov count towards the tally of Shloshim? When you began your Shiva before Yom Tov. But if the death occurred on Yom Tov, in which case, again, Shiva itself is delayed until after Yom Tov, maybe Yom Tov does not count towards the tally of Shloshim. To which the Gemara says, Eisvei, so try to figure this out still. Raise that now the Kasha. Regel olalo leminyan Shloshim. The days of Yom Tov count towards the full tally of Shloshim. What's the case? Ketzad, kavru b'tchilas haragel. If you went ahead, right, Reuven experienced the loss in the beginning of Yom Tov. He buried his father in the beginning of Yom Tov. Samona Shiva Achar Haregel. He observes a full Shiva after Yom Tov. Now I will say, this is a different kind of Shiva. Umalachto naases ayedei acherim. His malacha, right? He could have work done through others. Va'avodav v'shivchosav osim b'tzina b'soch beso. And ultimately, again, his servants have the ability to go ahead and work on his behalf, and even in his own privately. Vein Rabbi Misaskinbo, and the public doesn't have to come visit him during his official Shiva. Why not? Why not? I will say, why not? Why? This is very important. Why not? Because the assumption is they already visited him over Yom Tiv during his quote-unquote unofficial Shiva. Shekvarnis asku bo beregel, because they already went ahead and visited him over the course of Yom Tiv. Beregel olalo. And Abba said the days of Yom Tiv count towards the Shloshim Tiyufta. Abba say indeed this is a refutation to the position of Rava, and based on the Gemara it sounds like halacha l'maisa, that the days of Yom Tiv will count towards the Shloshim tally. See what Abba say? So here's what it sounds like comes out from the Gemara. Remember, in the case where you observed Shiva before Yom Tiv, do the days of Yom Tiv count towards Shloshim? This is an easy one. Do the days of Yom Tiv count towards Shloshim? Yes, absolutely. Why? Because also remember again, at least in our the way we pass halacha l'maisa is Yom Tiv comes along, cancels out the remainder of Shiva. By definition, now you're in Shloshim. So of course Yom Tiv is going to count towards Shloshim. The case that we're struggling with over here is the following case: death occurred on Yom Tiv. Right? Reuven lost his father on Yom Tiv. Reuven then goes in and buries his father on Yom Tiv. Let's go with what everybody agrees with. When does Shiva start? After Yom Tiv, right? Now we'll actually see, interestingly enough, we'll see this actually in today's daf. The last, in Galus, Yom Tiv Sheni actually counts as the first day of Shiva, even though you're not observing Shiva. We'll get to that detail. But again, halacha l'maisa, Shiva will start after Yom Tiv. The shayla we're trying to figure out is, can the days of Yom Tiv itself start the clock on Shloshim? In which case you would have an interesting halachic anomaly of Shloshim, technically, at least the clock for Shloshim beginning before Shiva. That never normally happens because normally Shiva starts everything, but can the clock for Shloshim begin before Shiva? So the Gemara seems to indicate, the conclusion of the Gemara seems to be, Yes. So the Gemara says, let's finish. We're not finished yet. Ki asa Rabin Amar Rabbi Yochanan afilu kavro beregel. This is true even halacha l'maisa. Even halacha l'maisa. Look at Rashi. Afilu kavro beregel. Regel olami and shloshim lomi by kavra kodem regel. It goes without saying that if burial took place before Yom Tiv, Shiva began before Yom Tiv, that Yom Tiv itself could count towards the tally of shloshim. But even comes along Rabbi saying Rabbi Yochanan, even if burial took place on Yom Tiv itself, in which case Shiva is delayed until after Yom Tiv, the clock for shloshim can begin on Yom Tiv itself. V'chein ori Rabbi Lazar l'Rabbi Pedas berei. And so too, Rabbi Avi'Elazar, paskin this way to Rabbi Pedas, his son, afilu kavro beregel, even if burial took place on the regel, despite the fact that Shiva will be delayed until after Yom Tiv, halacha l'maisa, the clock for shloshim can begin on Yom Tiv itself. Incredible. So I'll tell you, halacha l'maisa, the way the Shulchan Aruch paskin, this is in Siman Shin Tzadik Tes, in Yardea, halacha beis. Here's the halacha. Kover meisel beregel b'chol hamoed. If somebody goes ahead and buries their dead on chol hamoed. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch goes into some of the halachos concerning what you have to do, which I'm not going to get into. Haregel ola leminyan shloshim. They both say this is how we paskin halacha l'maisa, that if a burial takes place on chol hamoed, because remember again, we learned this before. Technically, you could bury even on Yom Tov Sheni. We don't really do that. We don't really do that anymore. In the Hasidic communities, they do it. The Yakish communities, they do it. But again, generally, if burial takes place on Chol HaMoed, ultimately Shiva is deferred until after Yom Tiv, but Haregel Ola Leminyan Shloshim. So we begin the count of the 30 days from the actual day of burial. So just to understand this, so whereas normally halacha l'maisa, you would go ahead and the shloshim begins from the first day of Shiva. From the first day of Shiva, halacha l'maisa, in a case like this where burial is occurring on Yom Tiv itself, the clock for shloshim begins on Yom Tiv. So you'll calculate the shloshim is the 30th day from the day of burial on Yom Tiv. Incredible. But let's go ahead. Again, there's more involved with this halakha. There are exceptions to this rule as well, but for our purposes, that's the halakha l'maisa. So the Gemara goes back to Torah Abanon. Kiyem kfiyas hamita shloshim kol regel. But if a person is mekayim kfiyas hamita. So remember again, the case of kfiyas hamita, we spoke about this in last week's staff actually, is the overturning of the bed. This was the practice. Kfiyas hamita was one of the morning practices during the times of the Gemara, literally turning over the bed. So if a person overturns his bed 3 days before Yom Tiv, the person does not have to go ahead and observe kfiyas hamita after Yom Tiv. They both say this is reflecting the idea. Remember again, we have different schools of thought, but there's a school of thought that says that the only time that Yom Tiv really cancels out Shiva is if you've observed some substantive chunk of Shiva prior to Yom Tiv. But if you have not observed a substantive chunk of Shiva, then what does Yom Tiv do? What does Yom Tiv do? It simply pauses it. It pauses it, and then you resume after Yom Tiv. So here the Gemara says, if a person observed 3 days of Kfiyas Hamita before Yom Tiv, you don't have to overturn your bed after Yom Tiv. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Chacham say no. Afilu yom achas va'afilu sha'achas. The Chacham say not true. As long as you observed any amount of Shiva, even 1 day, even 1 hour, right? Even 1 hour. And I both say, by the way, sha'achas doesn't even have to mean an hour. What does sha'achas mean? Couple of minutes. Any amount of time. If you observed any amount of time of Shiva before Yom Tiv, when Yom Tiv comes, ultimately again, it goes ahead and cancels out the rest of Shiva. Amar Rabbi Shimon, hein divrei beis Shammai, hein divrei beis Hillel. Beis Shammai omrim, shloshi yamim, ubeis Hillel omrim afil yom echad. So we'll say the Gemara just says, by the way, this is a yesodistic machlokes, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says the only time that halacha l'maisa Yom Tiv cancels out Shiva is if you observed some significant amount of Shiva. And what's significant? 3 days. 3 days. Whereas Beis Hillel says no, even as long as you observed any amount of Shiva, even just a moment of Shiva, Yom Tiv will come along and cancel out the rest. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Chia, Bar Abba, Amar Rav Yochanan, Amar Le, Rabbi Yochanan Lechia, Bar Abba, Rav Huna. Afilu yom echad afilu sha'achos. To which the Gemara says, Rava, so Rava Rava said, Halacha Kattan didan damar shlosha. Rava says the halacha follows our Tana, who says that Yom Tov only cancels out Shiva if you go ahead and you observe, if you've observed a significant chunk, which is at least 3 days. Rava said we know halacha l'maisa, we don't paskin that way. Halacha l'maisa, we paskin that as long as you've observed even just a moment, a few minutes of Shiva prior to Yom Tiv comes and cancels out the rest of Shiva. Incredible. So also the Gemara goes weiter. Some interesting stories. Ravina eklala Surah de Pras. Ravina went to the city of Surah by the river Pras, by the Euphrates. Both say apparently there are 2 surahs. There's Surah, right? Seaside Surah, Surah on the Euphrates. Must have been beautiful, right? Surah on the Euphrates, and Surah, which was like the major Torah city, like Surah Pumpadisa. So 2 different cities. So Ravina went to Surah on Pras by the Euphrates. Amalei Rav Chaviva l'Ravina Hilcha Samai. So listen to this. Rav Chaviva said to Ravina, "What's the halacha?" So both say, so again, what is the halacha? In other words, at what point in time will Yom Tiv cancel out Shiva? In other words, how much Shiva do you have to have observed in order for Yom Tiv to cancel it out? Amalei afilu Yom Echad. We'll say here it is. Ravina said, right? Ultimately, again, Ravina said, even one day, even one moment. Incredible. Yosef Rabbi Silber Abba Rabbi Ami Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka Akila Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar. So let's listen to this. Rabbi Silber Abba Rabbi Ami Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka. We're sitting on the Kila. We'll say Kila is like the terrace or the porch of Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar. Nafak milsa mevinayo. They started talking. But let's say, I just want to point out what a beautiful image this is. What a beautiful image this is. Both say they're sitting on the porch. I don't know, like on a rocking chair or something. You know, they're relaxing together. But I will say, how do Yidden relax together? They learn Torah. Lahavdil. Sometimes people get together and they speak about the most inane things. Right? When Jews get together and they're relaxing, right? They're making a l'chaim. That's my own version of this story, right? Right? They're sitting on the porch. So the Gemara said this is lashon nafik milsa v'inayo. Nafik milsa v'inayo means they didn't get together to have a targeted conversation, right? They didn't get together to discuss, but this was like a social visit. They were sitting together. But what do Jews do when they socialize? They talk Torah. Nafek milsa beinayhu. Here was what came up between them. It's so beautiful. Minay la'avela shiva. Okay, so I don't know that you have to talk about this when you socialize, right? But they will say what they were asking is, from where do we find the concept of shiva? In other words, they will say of a 7-day mourning period. Where does this concept come from? Dichsev, but listen to this. It's based. The Gemara says based on the pasuk in Amos. But Navi says, "Va'afachti chagechem le'evel." I will turn your Yom Tiv. This is when Chashbar was angry with Kal Yisrael. I will turn your Yom Tiv into mourning. Ma chag shiva, just like Yom Tiv is 7 days. Af avelos shiva. So to avelos is for 7 days as well. But 1 second, there's a Yom Tiv Shavuos. That's only 1 day. Homi by the Chidrei Shlakish. No, we're going to use that for a different halacha. Abosai. Damrei Shlakish Mishram Rabbi Yehuda Nisia Minayim L'Shmur Rechoka. She'eno noheges ela yom echad. We're going to get to that in just a moment. The shmo rechoka, which means delayed news of a loss. How do you know that if you get delayed news, which we'll define in just a moment, that you only have to observe morning practices for 1 day? It says, I will turn your Yom Tiv into a morning time, and there's a 1-day Yom Tiv as well. Atzeres that shows you that under certain circumstances, you could fulfill the obligations of mourning through just 1 day. We'll get to that in just a moment. We'll say, so something very important came out over here. This, the Gemara says, is the makar. This is the source for the concept of observing Shiva 7 days. So say, to be clear, there is no pasuk in the Torah. We'll talk about this in just a moment. The source for this comes from the Navi in Amos. Va'afachti chagechem le'evel. I will turn your Yom Tiv into a period of mourning, just like Chag. Yom Tiv is 7 days, so too Avelos is 7 days on. I will say, take a quick look at Tosas. Ma Chag Shiva, u'biyushami dayek ema shmona kishmona dechag, u'meshani shmini regal b'fnei atzmo. So say Yerushalmi says, I don't understand, so why don't you say 8 days? Because after all, again, Sukkot is 8 days, to which the Gemara says, no, Shmini Atzeres is not part of Sukkot. Shmini Atzeres is its own Chag. Okay, fine. But here's what I want to draw your attention to. The Gemara says, what about Mivayas la'eval shivat la'aviv eval shivas yamim? So I will say, we have a pasuk in the Torah that speaks about Shiva for 7 days. Where do we see that? At the end of Chumash Bereshis, that Yosef went ahead and observed for his father Evel Shivas Yamim. We'll say it's right. It's in the first pasuk in the Torah. They observed for Yaakov Avinu a mourning period of 7 days. So asks Tosfos, why are you bringing a pasuk from Amos? Why don't you bring a pasuk from Bereshis? We'll say, listen to this. Tosfos gives two answers. Number one, the Hasam Kodim Kvura Haya. We'll say number one, interestingly enough, when did they mourn for Yaakov 7 days? Before he was buried. Remember again, Yaakov's burial was in Canaan, was in Eretz Yisrael, was in Marsa Machpelah. They mourned for Yaakov in Egypt after his death, before his burial. So that's number one. So you can't learn out Shiva, right, post-burial Shiva, from a pre-burial Shiva. Number two, Tosfos says, Yerushalmi Nishani, they lemedin mikodem matan Torah. But say there's another reason. The Yerushalmi quotes a very important principle. We do not learn any binding halacha from any event which occurred prior to Matan Torah, prior to Sinaitic revelation. So therefore, I will say this event happened before Matan Torah. Therefore, we do not learn binding halacha. I will say the greatest example of this is what? Bris Milah, right? We find Bris Milah by Avraham Avinu, yet the Torah feels compelled to restate Bris Milah when? By Parshas Tazria. So why do you have to repeat it if we're learning by Avraham Avinu? Because again, Avraham Avinu teaches us the concept of Bris Milah, but binding halacha of Bris Milah only comes from the Torah, restating it after Matan Torah. Say for Rabbi, it turns out, so even though we have a concept of Shiva in the Torah, number one, it was a Shiva before burial. Number two, it was before Matan Torah. Therefore, the actual source for Shiva is going to be the pasuk in Amos. Incredible. So let's go back there. I forgot for a second that Shachar is at 6:30. I was so excited about that all this time. Okay, says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanan, let's go back there. Tan Rabbanan, Shmua Krova no Hagesh Shiva Ushloshim, Shmua Rechoka Eno no Hagesh Al Yomech. Let's listen to this Braisa. Braisa says as follows: Shmua Krova. Both say Shmua Krova. We're going to see is literally you hear of death in close proximity to the event. Shmua Rechoka is delayed knowledge of the event. So what's the halacha? We're gonna define this in just a moment. So Shmua Krova, you have to observe Shiva and Shloshim. Shmua Rechoka, only 1 day. Ezu Krova, Ezu Rechoka. Here we go. Krova b'sok Shloshim, Rechoka li'achar Shloshim divrei Rabbi Akiva. So let's listen to this. Rabbi Akiva's model is as follows. If you hear about the death of a close relative for whom you're obligated to mourn within 30 days, if you hear about it within 30 days, you observe a regular Shiva and a regular Shloshim. If you hear about it after 30 days, you only have to observe Shiva Avelos for 1 day. And we're going to see even that 1 day is not a whole day, even just a partial day. That's Rabbi Akiva. The Chum say no. No. Whenever you hear about the death of a close relative for whom you're obligated to mourn, whether you hear about it within 30 days, after 30 days, you observe a regular Shiva and a regular Shloshim. Whenever you see a situation of an individual who's mekel and the rabbim who are machmir, halacha kirabim. We'll see under normal circumstances, again, first of all, under normal circumstances, the halacha normally follows the rabbim, right? All the more so where the rabbim are machmir and the yachid is mekel, the halacha follows the rabbim. Chutz mizu, we'll say what's the exception to this rule? Hilchos Avelos. Shafa b'Rabbi Akiva mekel v'chamim machmir and halach Rabbi Akiva damrshua halacha kedivrei hamekel be'evel. We'll say when it comes to Hilchos Avelos, we always follow the more lenient opinion. Therefore, again, the Gemara wants to suggest that halacha l'maisa over here, the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva, and therefore Rabbi says it's a very important halacha. We're going to see this halacha l'maisa. If you hear about the death of a loved one for whom you're obligated to mourn, if you hear about the loss within 30 days, you're obligated to observe full Shiva, full Shloshim. If you hear about it after 30 days, you're only obligated to mourn for a very short period of time. And we'll see again, even then, we'll call it a day, but even then, A, it's not a full day, and B, It's not all of the morning practices. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Chanina Asli Shmuel. I'll just point out that's how I pass halacha l'maisa. I'll just mention. Well, let's go back there. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Chanina Asli Shmuel Davua Mebei Chozai. Rabbi Chanina heard about the death of his father. His father passed away in Bechozai. Rabbi Chanina only heard about it after 30 days. After 30 days. It's a Shmuel Rechoka, delayed news, and therefore you only have to observe 1 day of mourning. So again, all we know so far is that we pass like Rabbi Akiva, Shmuel Rechoka, 1 day of mourning, Shmuel Krova, full Shiva, full Shloshim. What we don't yet know is that by Shmuel Rechoka, what do you have to observe by that 1 day? We'll get to that. Rav Nosson bar Ami asili Shmuel de'imei mi Bechozai. Rav Nosson bar Ami heard that his mother passed away in Bechozai. Also, after 30 days, asili kamei derava amrale hari amru Shmuel rechoka ino nohages al yom echad bilbad. Told him to Shmuel rechoka. Therefore, all you have to do is observe morning practices for 1 day. Eisvei b'medra. When is this so? B'chamishe misei mitzvah. They will say this is true with the 5 relatives. Who are the 5 relatives? Son, daughter, brother, sister, spouse. 5 relatives. Aval al avi va'al imo shivu shloshim. When it comes to one's parents, no matter when you hear about the loss, you are obligated, even if it's a Shmuel Rechoka, you are obligated to observe a full Shiva and Shloshim. Amrale yichidohi. This is a singular opinion for those Siril and Kavase. We do not pass in this way. The Sanya, Maisa, listen to this. Maisa umeis Avev Rabbi Tzadok beginzak. One time Rabbi Tzadok's father passed away in the city of Ginzak. Vodiu li'achar shalosh shanim. And he only heard about it after 3 years. After 3 years. We're to us this is so alien. We know about things, everything, the moment after it occurred. I'm reminded, Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote that when he said goodbye to his father, Moshe Soloveitchik came to America first before the Rav. The Rav was right. Moshe Soloveitchik came to become the Rosh Yeshiva. What was then Yeshiva Rabbeinu Yitzchak Al Chanan? There wasn't no Yeshiva University yet. Yeshiva Rabbeinu Yitzchak Al Chanan, and the Rav was learning in university in Warsaw. The Rav said goodbye to his father. They shook hands, right? And the Rav said he didn't know if he would ever see his father again. Turns out he did. He came to America not so long afterwards. But again, that's the way the world was, right? As you said goodbye to a parent who was going overseas, you did not know what was happening. See, here again, Rabbi Tzadok's father passed away. And he didn't hear about it for 3 years. Uba v'shalas Elisha ben Avuya. Wow, there's so much to say about this. Who did he ask the Shaila to? To Elisha ben Avuya. Now understand, Elisha ben Avuya's name is almost never used in Shas. Whenever his name comes up, the name Acher is used instead. So the fact that he's quoted over Rabosai is something so incredibly amazing. The simple as Marsha explains, it's because this episode happened before Elisha ben Avuya went off the derech. And sometimes, again, we use Elisha ben Avuya's name before I went off the derech. We'll say, I like to think that every once in a while, the Shas sprinkles in the name Elisha ben Avuya to remind us that even an Acher could come back to an Elisha ben Avuya. That no one is beyond salvation. No one is so broken that they can't be repaired. So every once in a while, Shas will throw in their little Elisha ben Avuya. You know what? Yeah, he did some really terrible things in this world. But even Elisha ben Avuya, should he choose to turn it around, could absolutely do so. Va'amru, no, Shiva u'shloshim. And they told him you should observe Shiva and Shloshim. So I will say, this is reflective of this singular view that for the death of a parent, one always goes ahead and observes Shiva and Shloshim, even if they hear about it years later. We don't paskin this way. We paskin that a Shmuel Rechoka is a Shmuel Rechoka. If you hear about the death of any of the close relatives, including one's parents, after 30 days, all one does is go ahead and observe 1 day of mourning. So also listen to this story. Bino shal Rabbi Achia Bagola. I'm sorry, Ukishemes, Bino, Shrabi Achia Bagola, Yashav, did I skip here? No, I'm not good. Ukishemes Bino, Shrabi Achia Bagola, when the son of Rabbi Achia died in the diaspora, Yashav Alav Shiva Shloshim. He went ahead and he observed Shiva and Shloshim, even though again Bepashtos it was Ishmul Rechoka. He only heard about it after 30 days. Ini, is that so that Rabbi Achia observed Shiva and Shloshim even for a Shmuel Rechoka? Vaha, here we go. Vaha, Rav Bar Achuha de Rabbi Chia, Dehu bar achse de Bechia. Well, remember again, we had this on Tes Zayin. Well, that's on Tes Zayin. Rav was the son of the brother of Rabbi Chia and the son of the daughter of Rabbi Chia, right? So we explained this whole relationship back on Tes Zayin. So Rav was both the son of the brother of Rabbi Chia and the son of the sister of Rabbi Chia. So watch this. Ki sadak lahasam, when Rav went to visit Rabbi Chia, Amar le Abakayim. So again, Rav asked Rabbi Chia, how's your father? Now remember again, the father of Rav was Rabbi Chia's brother. So Rabbi Chia was asking, how's my brother doing? How's your father? How's my brother doing? So Rav responds, Amar le Amar Beis, Ima Kayemes. What about my mother? You don't want to know about how my mother's doing? Right? So we'll say, so Rav was very evasive. This is in general about the desire not to want to be the one who conveys bad news. So again, Rav's father had passed away. Rav did not want to say anything. So again, Rabbi Chia asks Rav, how's your father, my brother? And Rav says, oh, why don't you ask me about my mother? Amar le ima kayemes, how's your mother? Amar le abba kayem. Rav says, why don't you ask about my father? Right? So both say, so at this point in time, Rav is unwilling to answer about either how his father or his mother are doing. Amar le l'shamei. So both say, ultimately, again, Rabbi Chia realized what was going on. So at this point, Rabbi Chia realizes that both his brother and his sister have passed away. Amar le l'shamei, he said to his attendant, Chalutz li minali, take off my shoes for me. V'holech acharei klei lebeis hamerchatz, and go ahead and carry my utensils ultimately again to the beis hamerchatz, to the bathhouse. Now I will say there are three things you learn from this. Shema mina tlas, shema mina avel asabina sasandal. So we'll say, so remember again, at this point in time, just to understand what happened over here, Rabbi Chia got news that both his brother and sister passed away. But what kind of news was it? What kind of news? A shmua rechoka. These events occurred more than 30 days prior. So what does Rabbi Chia do? Rabbi Chia tells his attendant, take off my shoes and carry my stuff with me. We're going to the bathhouse. So you learn three things. Number one, Shema Mina, Avel asa bin Elias Asand. Number one, an Avel can't wear shoes. So we already saw that. We already learned that. But again, the Avel can't wear shoes. Ushma Mina, Shmua Rechoka, Einon Hages El Yom Echad. Furthermore, I will say, what do you see from here? Shmua Rechoka only lasts for 1 day. And I will say, now, how do you see that Shmua Rechoka only lasts for 1 day? Because remember, what does Rabbi Chia say to his attendant? Take off my shoes. That's ultimately again for morning. But where are we going? Where are we going? To the bathhouse. Right? Now, I will say, now again, going to the bathhouse, why? Remember, bathing is usher for an Avel. So what he's saying is, I'm going to observe Avelis now, but we're going to the bathhouse, which means the Avelis is not going to last. And the last thing, which is tied in, Ushma Mina, Miktsasem Gekulo, that when you observe that 1 day for Avelos, you don't have to observe a full day, but only a partial day. So remember again, so see what's happening over here. Number one, for Shmuel Rechoka, an Avel can't wear shoes. Rabbi Chia takes off his shoes. Number two, for a Shmuel Rechoka, you only have to observe 1 day of Avelos. And number three, that 1 day need not be a complete day. Remember, Rabbi Chia takes off his shoes. And right after that, where do they go? The bathhouse. So you see from here, you only have to observe part of a day. And once you observe more, they mix it to Kekula. They go into the bathhouse. Supposed to going to the bathhouse represents the end of the Avelos for the Shmua Rechoka. Incredible. Rabbi, so the Gemara is supposed to say, the point over here, again, the point over here is, 1 second, how do you reconcile these two stories? Here, Rabbi Chia is only observing, right, 1 day and a partial day for a Shmua Rechoka. And in the previous story, Rabbi Chia is observing a full Shiva and Shloshim for a Shmua Rechoka. So how do you reconcile this? The Gemara says it's not a contradiction. The Gemara says, how do you reconcile it? The Gemara says, Rabbi Chia l'chod, Rabbi Achia l'chod. It's two different people. One is Rabbi Chia and one is Rabbi Achia. Okay, good. So we'll say, Am Rabbi Yossi bar Abin, Shama Shmuel Krova Beregel, Ulamatzei Regel Nasis Rechoka. But also listen to this fascinating case. What if you hear about the death of a loved one on Yom Tiv, and by the time Yom Tiv finishes, it is a Shmuel Rechoka? Rabbi says, hear this case. Let's say a person goes out and hears about the death of a relative, a simple case, on the last day of Pesach. Right? Reuven hears that his father passed away on the last day of Pesach. But again, it's Yom Tiv. It's Yom Tiv. So by the time he could do something about it, then when? By the time Yom Tiv is over, it's already 31 days. It's already 31 days. So both say, so does he observe this as a Shmua Krova? And therefore after, because he heard about it within 30 days. Therefore again, after Yom Tiv, does he observe ultimately Shiva and Shloshim? Or does he look at this as a Shmua Rechoka because it's not actually actionable until after 30 days? So both says, listen to this incredible case. So the Gemara says, right, Shama Shmua Krova b'Shabbos, or same idea. So, Shama Shmua Krova b'Regel, the Matzah Regel Nasas Rechoka, Olelo, Ve'ino Noik El Yom Echad. Ultimately, I will say he only has to observe one day. Since it's not actionable until after Yom Tiv, by the time he could act on it, it's a Shmua Rechoka, and therefore he only has to observe one day. Similarly, Tana Rabbi Adam in Kesari coming to Rabbi Yochanan, Shama Shmua Krova b'Shabbos. If you heard news about the death of a loved one on Shabbos, you heard about it within 30 days. Ulamatzi Shabbos Nasis Rechoka. And on Shabbos, right by the time it's actionable on Matzah Shabbos, it's already 31 days. Eino noig el yom echad. Rabbi say you only observe one day. Rabbi say, by the way, see here what the halacha is saying? If you hear about the news of a death of a loved one within 30 days, but it's not actionable until post 30 days, it's treated as a shmua rechoka, delayed news, and therefore you only observe 1 day of mourning, which Rabbi say is an incredible Musar Haskila as well. Having knowledge in life is only meaningful if you do something with it. Right? Knowledge is only meaningful if it's actionable. To know things, but not act on them. Right? To know that I love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but not to do anything with that love. To know that I love Torah, but not to do anything with that love. To know that I care about my kids, I care about my wife, but I don't do anything with that knowledge is meaningless. A non-actionable knowledge doesn't count for anything. That's the Gemara is saying over here. Reuven knows that his father died. It's Shabbos. He knows that he died. He found out within 30 days. But it's not actionable until day 31. That's called the Shmua Rechoka. Having knowledge and not being able to do anything with it in halacha is not recognized as significant. So a lot of times in life, we know things. A lot of times in life, we have hashkafas, we have yediyas, we have mahalchim in life. That's fantastic. But your hashkafas are meaningless unless, of course, you do something with them. Your dreams, your aspirations, your goals are meaningless unless they're actionable. Knowledge without action is just simply knowledge. It's dvarim shebalev. And as we know in halacha, dvarim shebalev einam dvarim. The Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, Korea or Eino Korea? Boss, here's an interesting idea. What about Shmur Rechoka? So boss, here's what we've established. So boss, halacha lemaisa, you hear about the death of a loved one within 30 days, Shiva Shloshim. That's a Shmur Krova. After 30 days, Shmur Rechoka, 1 day. I also know that what? I don't have to observe a whole day, just part of a day. What about Kriya? Do you have to do Kriya on a Shmua Rechoka? So the Gemara is Korea. Rabbi Mani says you don't do Kriya. Rabbi Chanina Amar Korea. Rabbi Chanina says you do Kriya. Amar le Rabbi Mani, Rabbi Chanina. Shamani said Rabbi Chanina Bishtama lididi damina eno Korea. So according to me, he says you don't do Kriya. Hainu delo ika avelos shiva. It makes sense because there's no shiva. He wants to say that Kriya is a function in shiva. And if there's no shiva, there's no kriya. Eladidach da amrit korea. Kriya below shiva mi'ika. Is there ever such a thing as kriya without shiva? Velo? No, there's not such a thing as kriya without shiva. V'hatanya isi avod Rabbi Zera. V'amri le'achod Rabbi Zera. Kamed Rabbi Zera. Mishe'ein lo chaluk. Likra. Let's say, Rahman al-Islam, someone is in mourning for a loved one, and they don't have an article of clothing to tear. Now, when would you ever have a situation of you don't have an article of clothing to tear? I'm wearing borrowed clothing. So if I borrowed a cloak, I don't have a right to tear your clothing. So what's the halacha? So you don't tear. Shiva, and you go out and you get a cloak within Shiva, Korea, you tear. La'achar Shiva, ultimately, again, if it's after Shiva, you don't tear. Ani Rabbi Zira Basrei, when is that so? B'chamisha mesei mitzvah. That's true ultimately, again, with the other 5 relatives, meaning excluding parents. But for parents, you tear kriya forever. Whenever you hear about the death of a parent, we'll discuss this halacha, you always tear kriya. That's not a din in kriya, that is a din in kavod for one's parents. So we'll stop over for today, but the way we paskin is that halacha l'maisa, Shulchan Aruch in Simin Taf Beis, Sif Dalid, says as follows, Ein korin al shmua rechoka. So we'll say, here we go. So where we paskin, just listen to this halacha lemaisa. The way paskin is, if you hear about death within 30 days, that's a shmua krova, and one goes ahead and does shiva and shloshim. Hear about death of any of the 7 close relatives after 30 days, that's called a shmua rechoka. You only observe 1 day. What do you do essentially? Take off your shoes, sit on a low chair. Do you do kriya? Shulchan Aruch paskins, no. Ein korin al shmua rechoka. You do not do kriya for shmua rechoka except al aviv va'al imo korea liolam. But when one hears about the death of a parent, chas v'shalom, even if they're hearing about it after 30 days, one will observe a truncated shiva, or one will observe a truncated avelos, and one does kriya for a parent whenever they find out about the death of the parent. That's not really a din in kriya. It's a din rather in kibud avva'im. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up with the rest of the sugi tomorrow. We'll say shkoyach.